Good afternoon. I'm Roslyn, Layton of Strand Consult. Welcome to this discussion of the single most important telecom policy issue, spectrum. Many thanks to CSIS for graciously hosting our event today. Spectrum is national security, meeting America's spectrum needs. Please see the series of papers on this topic written by Senior Vice President and Director of CSIS Strategic Technologies Program, James A. Lewis. He joins us on today's panel. Many national security experts say we are on the brink of World War III. There are some 50 armed conflicts around the world. China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, nuclear-capable adversaries that America once managed in silos, now conspire against us. Given the situation, one could conclude that we need to double down on defense and give the armed forces everything they need, including all the airwaves. However, it's not clear which radio frequencies are essential for the U.S. military and whether they can do more and better with less. Outside the USA and Pacific theaters, the American military uses frequencies harmonized to international standards. But it's a different story here in America, where the military occupies many of the bands which otherwise would be used by consumers. China, America's leading adversary, has a formidable wireless value chain and abundant exclusive use spectrum, 3 times the amount we have allocated in the USA. The wireless tech that's incubated in China makes its way to USA, gets embedded in our ecosystem. This tech is a channel for the Chinese Communist Party, creating yet another security challenge. Now, the window of opportunity for the U.S. to catch up on China on this front is closing. Auction authority at the Federal Communications Commission expired 2 years ago and has not been renewed. We have 0 spectrum in the pipeline for exclusive consumer use, and after years of study, the Pentagon said it needs more time to determine which bands it can share, let alone those it can relinquish. Indeed, some Pentagon actors have suggested that we should do no further spectrum auctions. This is the American innovation that was awarded with a Nobel Prize. The economy and security played key roles in the U.S. presidential election. Federal spending associated with inflation has also been on the ballot. Our government spends tens of billions of dollars for broadband subsidies, presumably monies that private sector actors may invest had they had the right incentives. Fortunately for consumers, broadband prices have fallen on account of growing competition and innovative technologies. Increasingly, consumers are choosing fixed wireless access, or FWA, for broadband. However, we are out of exclusive use spectrum to fuel the consumer demand going forward. We're going to learn more about this issue today with a series of exciting speakers. This includes Shiva Goel, Senior Advisor for Spectrum Policy at the National Telecommunications Information Administration, who will discuss the way forward with evidence-based policy. We'll turn to our former acting head of NTIA and professor of law at Michigan State, Adam Candeub. We also have the best-selling author, Arthur Herman. He is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Hudson Institute's Quantum Alliance Initiative. And last but not least, we also have Umair Javed, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the CTIA Wireless Association. Today's event is live streamed, and you could submit questions on the event page. Please share and tweet on X at CSIS_tech. So to give us some background on this important discussion, we're going to turn to Jim Lewis, who has published a series of papers explaining this situation and looking back at the 30 years of this issue. So, Jim, the allocation of spectrum policy is frequently presented as a binary choice between commercial interests and national security. Yet in your series of reports, you have written that this is a false dichotomy. And you further observe that economic strength is the foundation of our national security. Can you set the stage for our audience and elaborate on how allocating spectrum for license use is a strategic decision that underpins our economic and national security?
Sure. Thank you, Roslyn. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Let me begin by noting that our first report here at CSIS on spectrum management was in 2008. It was on a commission chaired by James Schlesinger, the former Secretary of Defense. And the thing that's a little startling is that many of the problems we looked at in 2008 are still problems today. And so some of the issues we've talked about are spectrum sharing will save us. That was our belief in 2008, turned out not to be true. We looked at how you modernize spectrum use to make it more effective, both for the economy and for national security. And that we haven't made so much progress is disturbing. What are some things that are worth looking at? It's worth looking at the rest of the world. The way they allocate spectrum, the spectrum allocations they've made are different from those made by the US. Many of the terms that we'll use, I think, in the discussion will be familiar to the audience. We're going to talk about auction authority, as you mentioned, the Spectrum Relocation Fund, which used to be a crucial part of modernization, the WRC, the ITU body that handles global spectrum allocations. So we have argued here, me and my colleague, Cleet Johnson, that we need to redefine national security to take into consideration the importance of technological leadership and economic strength in the 21st century. And that's where the current system could use some help. So with that, let me stop and say I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that groundwork. And I'm thrilled that we're joined by Shiva Goel, who is the from NTIA. And without further ado, Shiva, you are most welcome. We'd love to hear your thoughts and the vision for evidence-based policy in this critical issue.
Thanks, Roslyn. And Jim, I think you also set the scene well for what I'd like to talk about today. And thanks to CSIS for hosting this important event and timely one. Look, big picture, spectrum has taken on such a significant role in our daily lives that the president himself has called it one of the nation's most important national resources. We are officially on the map. We're talking about a resource that powers everything from the phones in your pockets and purses to satellites in space delivering broadband. We're talking about an enabler of new technology, whether that means 6G, next-gen Wi-Fi, connected cars, advanced manufacturing. And we're talking about a resource for which demand, as you've heard, is surging by the day. In 2023 alone, Americans used more than 100 trillion megabytes of wireless data. That was much more than they used the year before. And it's more than all the data that passed over wireless networks from 2010 to 2018 combined. Now, some of those same forces that are driving private sector demand also affect the government. Whether you're talking about weather observation or defending the Pacific, government missions are also becoming more spectrum dependent. And to further complicate matters, as you've also heard, many critical government systems already operate in or near frequencies eyed by the commercial sector. This hits close to home at NTIA because our twin mandates place us right at that busy intersection of commercial and federal spectrum demand. By statute, we manage federal agencies' use of spectrum. And as a spectrum manager, we want to make sure our agencies have the resources they need to execute on their missions effectively and in a spectrally efficient way. By statute, we're also the president's principal advisor on telecommunications and information, and that includes spectrum matters. And as the president's advisor, we care deeply about ensuring that the United States remains global leader in building wireless tech. Now, I can tell you it's not easy being stuck right in the middle of that intersection with traffic coming at you from each and every way, sometimes the wrong way. And there are a few mantras that we at NTIA have embraced to rise to meet that challenge of that role. And I'd like to take the rest of my time to just unpack a few of them because we believe in them very strongly. The first one, which Roslyn and Jim teed up perfectly, is the by now common adage in spectrum that economic security is national security, that they're two sides of the same coin, because in a 21st century economy, dual use benefits are so often the name of the game. The second mantra is that to advance those dual objectives, we have to commit to exploring what folks around here call the full art of the possible. That means embracing evidence. It means embracing data to find a path forward, even when it's hard, even where a good outcome may strike many as impossible or not worth the effort. Let's start with that first mantra and unpack it a little bit. What do we mean by economic security as national security? How do we think about it at NTIA? Well, first, there's a simple fact that economic strength increases our influence and helps us fund our national defense. It pays to be strong. And when you consider Spectrum's direct value, what someone might pay for it, and its indirect value, all the activity it supports, it becomes obvious how vital Spectrum is to our economy and our economic well-being as a whole. People are putting numbers behind this. If you look at the wireless industry, carriers have invested $190 billion into their networks in the 5G era alone, $30 billion just last year. And of course, there's revenue they make from those investments. And there's the knock-on effects in terms of what people are doing with the services that are being delivered. When you put it all together, you're talking about millions of jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars in GDP each year. Spectrum-dependent technologies like Wi-Fi are making similar contributions, albeit in different ways. But the point is, you take this stuff together, and we are talking impacts on a multi-trillion-dollar scale each year from just two among many wireless technologies. And we are, for the moment, putting aside social benefits that are harder to quantify, like the value of scientific research, keeping our national airspace system safe, and of course, strengthening our national defense. And that leads us to another even more direct impact. Now more than ever before, wireless technologies directly support national security missions, which are increasingly harnessing capabilities once thought of as exclusively or primarily commercial. Our military, for example, is working to harness 5G, not just at home, but in expeditionary environments as well. And it's easy to understand why. From a consumer's perspective, you might like a network that lets you Zoom in HD on the go. I certainly do. My laptop failed, and I'm on cellular data right now, and so far it's working swimmingly. Well, that same technology could help force protection systems or even a warfighter see more clearly too, and detect and respond to threats more effectively. Now, these are just some examples that DoD has put out there, but the overarching point is that everyone benefits from the innovation that Spectrum enables, and our agencies are already working to leverage those capabilities for military advantage in particular. I should add that this isn't just a terrestrial phenomenon, it's happening in space as well. You don't need to venture far beneath the fold to read about how a commercial satellite system might make a difference on the battlefield. And in fact, the Space Force now has an explicit strategy to leverage commercial off-the-shelf solutions where possible. Now, when we're talking about dual commercial and military use, there's a very specific type of spectrum technology that comes to mind that I think can drive economic prosperity and national security benefits at the same time. I'm talking about a technology that's focused explicitly on deconflicting and thereby expanding access to spectrum. I'm talking about dynamic spectrum sharing, or DSS. DSS helps manage the efficient shared use of spectrum by multiple systems, like an incumbent federal system and a commercial new entrant. Commercially, this technology is important because the low-hanging fruit in spectrum will soon be gone. Untapped frequency bands are becoming smaller in number and only tougher to clear cost-effectively and in a short amount of time. And by the way, the minimum bandwidth that operators need is also going up, which makes the equation even harder to solve in the long run. Now, you may not think that DSS is a viable near-term solution for bands under consideration today, and that's an issue that we're studying. But when you look to the future of spectrum use, it's hard not to think that getting this capability right and building on it is important. Some component of sharing, whether it's the predominant model in a band or whether it's just needed with respect to some systems in some areas, is going to be key in maximizing commercial spectrum access over the long haul. The benefits of DSS, though, aren't simply commercial, and that's another thing that makes it important. Just like DSS can make it easier to deconflict wireless operations in the United States, it can also make it easier for the U.S. and our allies to operate in the crowded, chaotic, and dirty spectrum environment that is typical of modern conflict zones. Dual use, as I said, is the name of this game, and with DSS, you're talking about potentially huge benefits on both sides over the long run. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how spectrum policy can help us build a robust and trusted supply chain, which is very important to NTIA and commerce as a whole. Because when you put forward a credible path to expanding access in a new frequency band, you're also igniting the development of an entire ecosystem. Semiconductor companies will begin to support the band in the chipset. Equipment makers will build the radios or the APs, and device makers the handsets, tablets, the hardware. Network operators will deploy, consumers will access better services, and then comes growth and innovation in our applications, which benefit from new capacity and better performance all the time. U.S. companies are leading semi-designers, we're leading handset makers, we're leading network operators, and we lead in software too. And I do worry about what happens if our markets don't benefit from that spark, while markets dominated by the likes of Huawei and ZTE do. So let's switch gears. What are we doing about this at NTIA? How is NTIA working to strengthen our national spectrum position? Well, we're living by that second mantra and committing to exploring the full art of the possible every day. It sounds cheesy, but engineers at NTIA literally use that phrase in meetings and hallway conversations all the time. And the reason they put their work in those terms is that the challenge ahead of us truly is a challenge. It's hard. Bands of interest to the commercial sector are also home to a large number and a large diversity of federal incumbent systems that support essential operations. We can't compromise those missions as we expand commercial access. It's just like economic security is national security. Well, national security is national security as well. Radar systems that protect our homeland and our allies still need to work. Our military still needs reliable SATCOM. Going beyond the military, weather prediction that we all rely on daily still needs to occur. So, of course, does research into deep space and how life is on Earth. So what I'm telling you is that we have to do it all in Spectrum. That's just what we've signed up for. And to do that, we have to be committed to the hard work and analysis necessary to find real win-wins. That's exactly what NTIA has been doing, partnership with agencies across government as we implement the National Spectrum Strategy, and in particular with the band studies. In the lower 37 gigahertz band, we're coordinating a final report outlining a path forward for both federal and commercial innovation in this band. As that study comes to a close, we're moving fast on 18 gigahertz as well, and on a way forward that enhances commercial access, protects federal incumbents, and equips federal agencies to ship unique systems to commercial space networks. Those are win-wins. And of course, the bands that everyone wants to talk about and that are critically important, lower 3 gigahertz and 78 gigahertz. In those bands, our interagency technical interchange groups have rolled up their sleeves and they're hard at work already. They've started to collect input from industry and use cases, and they're busy right now blueprinting a path and a plan to go from ideas to analysis and soon results. Remember, these are bands and scenarios that were always there, that nobody wanted to touch because of how complicated they are and what's in them today. And oh, by the way, at least one of them encompasses frequencies that we're exploring in depth, while China is opposing action on the global stage. Not shying away from a challenge. That's what I mean by committing to the full art of the possible. Now, there's more work to come, and we're going to follow the evidence where it goes. We're going to work with agencies to gather better data on how these bands are used. We're going to get the modeling right when we evaluate interference, because as many of you know, that can make a huge difference in terms of spectrum availability. And in fact, our Institute for Telecommunications Sciences, our lab out in Boulder, Colorado, is already hard at work taking millions of measurements to better understand signal propagation in both of these bands. We're also going to proceed as transparently as possible and with your input, so we're held accountable as we develop results. Staying evidence-based, data-driven, and accountable, that's also what we mean when we say we're going to commit to the full art of the possible. Now, I know some are hoping to define the results up front without a study, and I understand the rush. I understand the challenge. But at the end of the day, we're managing a multi-trillion-dollar portfolio of spectrum for the public. We owe it to them to get this right, to do so in a way that keeps us competitive, innovative, scientifically informed, and secure. And we'll get there. I'm sure you'll no doubt hear other perspectives as well from the esteemed panel that follows. And thanks for allowing me to set the scene here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.
Shiva, thank you so much. I think that was an excellent table setting. I know that we have limited time, so let me just pose one question that came in from the audience. This had to do with receiver performance. It said if DoD receivers are vulnerable to even limited regulated commercial transmissions, what does that say about the readiness against bad actors? Could improving federal receiver performance be a way to enhance both national security missions and opportunities for commercial use?
It's a great question. It's an insightful one. And I think it's another example of work that can produce win-wins in both the economic realm and the national security realm. And, as the national spectrum strategy progresses, I think receiver performance is something we're going to take a look at and find ways to improve. Appreciate the comment.
Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today, and keep on keeping on.
Thanks, Roslyn. Take care.
Bye-bye. Great. Well, we're going to turn to our panel. I'm going to shift to you, Adam, because you were at the helm at NTIA in the last administration. I want to pick up on a comment that Jim mentioned at the beginning with this promise of spectrum sharing going back to 2008. And Brent Skorup of Cato Institute reminded me that this promise actually goes back to 1991. And we had the same idea that that these things that we could have both sharing, it would work. But in the meanwhile, we've actually seen the market prove on things like auctioning white spaces and using overlay licenses has produced real results in terms of investment and rollout. So I'm curious if maybe you have some thoughts on Shiva's remarks, and maybe you could tell us a bit about your interpretation of what has which many term as a federal commercial spectrum impasse.
Right. Well, first of all, I guess starting with the second question first, right now Congress has not given authority for auctions, and that's the first step. I think as the speakers have pointed out, this is a very difficult issue that pits national security, important government interests and public interests against private development. And Congress has come out a certain way. I think that's the first step if that's where we as a government, as a society want to go. It's a very difficult balance to make. Once the decision is made, however, reminding me of my time back at NTIA, under the Trump administration, we were tremendous in rolling out spectrum. We got tremendous progress in once the auction authority was given in getting it to auction and getting markets done. And I think that does rely upon investigating everything that's on the table, every technique you have. Certainly the 5G auctions did. And you're right. There are the technical limitations, the newer techniques, sharing capacities, they're being introduced slowly, but they're, I think, a necessary part of any modern solution, because it is a limited resource to some degree. The same way that improved receiver standards can be as well, because spectrum is not a thing. It's a tango between the receiver and the use and potential interference. And so I think NTIA, which doesn't have direct authority over these things, of course, but in improving information and allowing these decisions to be made throughout both the technological ecosystem and the federal government is a really good and solid approach.
Right. Well, let me go to you, Arthur. We're jockeying with China to build a future in which technological advances and growth, that we want those to be grounded in growth and democracy, not authoritarianism. Can you talk about this specifically, and how is this spectrum deficit that we're experiencing facilitate China's quest to dominate the 5G era and beyond? And maybe you might tell us a little bit about your Quantum Alliance Institute, and what does Spectrum mean for you and the technologies that you're trying to promote?
Well, it's here's why I look at it. I got into the spectrum issue not from the point of view of spectrum itself as a telecommunications area, but who's using spectrum for what purpose. And I was drawn to this question because I was very much alarmed, as many of us were, at the way in which China's tech giant Huawei was really building a global monopoly on 5G service and architecture around the world, including many of our leading allies, including NATO allies, who were signed on with Huawei. And the concerns were two. Number one, the fact that you had a Chinese tech giant like Huawei basically running and controlling these networks for really advanced wireless service, but also that because Huawei would be engaged in maintaining these networks that they were building out, that they would be free to supply the data that was flowing through those networks to Chinese military and intelligence services, and that this had to be stopped. That something had to be done in order to protect the future of 5G from being controlled by Beijing. And so in 2018, I began a intense campaign using my column at Forbes.com, but also other venues and conferences to push back on the Huawei juggernaut and to encourage instead the idea that we needed to keep 5G free, as you were saying, free and open and conducive to democratic values, not inimical to them. And in the course of that discussion, in the course of those next 2 years, it was kind of like ultimate fighting championship. I still have the scars from the battles that I had with Huawei and their representatives, including in this country on this issue. And in fact, it reached the point where Huawei threatened to sue and to shut down my column because they felt that I was just a little too either spreading falsehoods or maybe getting too close to the truth about what their goals were and what their methods were in building out and developing that 5G monopoly. And then in 2020, that same year, I was invited to come to join the National Security Council to help with the battle that they were launching to also extend the Huawei ban that we were developing for Huawei equipment in this country, to extend it to other countries, including getting them to stop looking to Huawei to build their 5G networks. And so I was working with people like Matt Pottinger and others in order to develop this. But there were two key problems that we had. And that was, number one, is that the carriers in the United States, who should have been our allies in looking for ways in which to prevent Huawei's growth, were in fact, I think, playing a very passive role in this. And some of them were, it seemed, quite comfortable with the idea of partnering with Huawei in order to build 5G networks on the terms that, in many cases, economically financially favorable terms that Huawei was offering. And that was a problem. And I have to be honest with you and with your audience, and that is that CTIA, which is the cell phone lobbying organization, was not very helpful on this and didn't seem to understand the larger national security concerns that we all had with what was happening here. The other problem, though, was that we didn't really able to offer a U.S. alternative. And so when I would talk to diplomats or to companies or members of legislatures in Europe, the Dutch, for example, and point out the dangers of working with Huawei, and what the risks were for them, for their national security, as well as for the future of a free and open 5G. They would take the argument and say, well, then what do you offer as an alternative? And there was nothing. That we hadn't really come up with even a national strategy or a way in which to manage spectrum that would be supportive of an alternative to Huawei. And that's why our focus became more and more on the spectrum and that was in the hands of the Department of Defense. The spectrum hoard, I would even call it, an enormous amount of spectrum, which DoD considered its exclusive property, and that we encouraged them instead to think about sharing and finding ways to work out a sharing arrangement so that that part of spectrum could be used for developing a 5G alternative to what Huawei was involved with. And it was as if DoD just didn't seem to realize how important 5G technology and preventing Huawei from controlling that technology was from a national security point of view. Their biggest concern was they didn't want to share any of that spectrum because they felt that they would need all of it, or almost all of it, in case of a national emergency or in order to provide services for our military in the course of it. And this became a battle that lasted all the way down the last days of the Trump administration, with us pushing, including the Secretary of Defense and his Chief of Staff, saying this is the program we should take, at least embrace the idea of sharing spectrum, and we couldn't get any kind of movement on it at all. Now, since then, there has been more movement on the part of DoD towards the idea of sharing spectrum. There was a report that came out this last April, the Embrace report, which endorsed the idea of spectrum sharing for DoD for commercial purposes, with very strict stipulations laid down at the same time. And we also have the Navy, which has released a section of their reserve spectrum to commercial use. That's the CBRS project, which is underway, which is certainly looking like a success. Everyone acknowledges it, but it's a tiny slice of the overall spectrum that DoD is controlling, and that in many ways, I believe, is not really going to be all that it is. Far more than they could use and under any kinds of circumstances. I don't think they really understand how spectrum really operates, to be frank. And I don't think we're going to see any big changes in the way in which we think about spectrum in relation to national security if it's coming from DoD itself. There has to be, I think, another plan, another strategy developed by others as a way in which to release that spectrum, and to make it clear to DoD that yes, if there is a national emergency, if we find ourselves in a kinetic conflict with China, for example, it can take back the spectrum which it has leased out to or loaned out to commercial uses and to commercial companies. But for right now, I feel that there's still enormous amount of work that's left to be done in both understanding the full implications of spectrum, of 5G and then 6G for national security, but also understand that so much of this debate and much of this discussion really needs to focus on getting DoD to recognize that it must share the wealth. It must be open to the idea that commercial companies and the development of spectrum in the commercial sector was really going to be important for their future. It's not an obstacle to national security. It's going to be a huge benefit for what goes forward. And that's where the state of the battle is right now.
Arthur, thank you for that perspective. And clearly, you touched upon what I think is a policy evolution on the national security front. Umair, let's turn to you. I mean, CTIA has been mentioned, and clearly, I think you've seen this for quite a long time yourself. We're looking at 30 years of auction history. And come to an abrupt pause, if you will, but maybe you could describe how your organization sees national security and what is exclusive use and why is it so important?
Happy to do that, absolutely. And maybe let me start responding a little bit to Arthur to begin. I don't think it's fair to say that the wireless industry has been passive on national security. I think quite the opposite, actually. I think the wireless industry has recognized the threat to national security from Huawei going all the way back to 2012. Nationwide carriers led the country in making sure not to include Huawei equipment in their networks before there was any government mandate to do so or any government policy on that. Wireless carriers invested more than $190 billion to win the race to 5G, deploy early, deploy that technology faster than any predecessor technology. Today, nationwide carriers are leading the deployment of Open RAN compliant technologies as well as a response to the Huawei threat. I think, perhaps where the difference is that wireless carriers rightfully questioned the wisdom of nationalizing private networks as an answer to the Huawei threat. I think the right path was competition, investment, information sharing, diplomacy, and that's perhaps where the paths differed. In terms of the question that you were asking, Roslyn, I think you make a really important point. I think a lot of the ways we talk about Spectrum today seems to have forgotten the lessons we learned over the last 30 years about the value of market-based policies. And so back in the 90s, maybe I could do a little stage setting here, there was a landmark shift in the way we thought about commercial spectrum. And it happened when we acknowledged that, yes, spectrum is a scarce resource, but that quality in itself isn't really all that relevant to whether government needs to control it. The whole point of a market, after all, is to rationally allocate scarce resources, and that can be true for spectrum as well. In fact, it can be more efficient than just giving it away for free at the whims of a government agency. And that sounds obvious today, but it was really outside the mainstream thinking back then. And it's very different than the command and control framework that still exists for federal spectrum, where there is very little transparency, no secondary markets, really no built-in incentives or opportunity costs for things like efficient use. And so in the rearview mirror, those market-based policies have been a resounding success, right? The FCC has held more than 100 spectrum auctions. It's auctioned more than 94,000 licenses. It's raised more than $200 billion in revenues. And it's unlocked more than $1 trillion in benefits for the American people. And not surprisingly, those policies, our policies, have become a model for regulators worldwide. And the foundation of all of that success has really been that exclusive use license spectrum. It's proven to be the best allocation model for building and supporting world-leading wireless networks. And what I mean by exclusive spectrum is an allocation model where licensees have the sole right to transmit on specific frequencies in a specific geographic area. And so wireless carriers, television and radio broadcasters, utility companies, federal agencies, they all rely on that kind of spectrum because it offers reliability and certainty of access. And those are two things you need if you're really trying to justify making very large investments to deploy communications infrastructure and ensure a high quality service. And so that's what we're talking about. It matters because we need more, as we heard from a lot of the other speakers today. We need more licensed full power spectrum to keep leading the world. Other countries are making more of this kind of spectrum available than the United States. Analysis Mason had a report demonstrating that our economic peers and our global rivals on average had access to about 44% more of this kind of spectrum than the United States. And we're also a little bit out of balance. If you look at the spectrum that's really important, it's the mid-band spectrum. About 600% of the federal government controls about 600% more of it than is available for licensed commercial use. And the amount of mid-band for unlicensed or shared use also eclipses what's available for licensed spectrum by 4 to 1. So it means the US is leading on these other spectrum allocation models, but we're sort of trailing on license. I think that's where we need to focus our efforts. And as Adam mentioned at the start, step one is restoring FCC auction authority to have these kinds of auctions again.
Well, thank you for that. Let's go back to you, Adam, and I hope you'll bring some of your academe into the picture here. Maybe that you might share with us what's really the ideal type when we talk about the spectrum allocation from the regulatory or administrative law perspective. A number of the speakers have said, different countries do things differently. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. But what would you say? I mean, of course, you are working in the university. You probably have regulators are talking to you, and you go to conferences around the world, as I know. So what, is there an ideal type of how it should work? I mean, it's especially interesting to see new countries. I would just want to give the example of Sweden, which before the invasion of Ukraine, they were going to they had almost no defense spending. They didn't think it mattered, turned on a dime, became a completely defense-oriented nation, but said our spectrum policy should basically about privatize everything so we make money and we can fund our defense needs, because they had to almost start from zero. I mean, of course, NATO was there, getting into NATO. Sorry for a bit of a side, but it's interesting that the latecomers maybe do things differently. So I'm curious, what can you share with us from your perspective?
Yeah, right. So, from an academic perspective, in theory, I teach Ronald Coase's article in the FCC, which says, we should have complete transferability of spectrum. However, when you go work at the NTIA, it's sort of like theory meets fact, which is, of course, I still think, and the experts on the panel can correct me, that the single largest user of spectrum in the entire world is the United States military. It's a very difficult balancing game you have to have, because I think, as the speakers are correct, and as you pointed out, and as the nation of Sweden is correct too, is that our national defense depends not simply on the ability of the military to fulfill its mission at this moment, but also the continued vitality of the American economy and advancements in technologies, particularly that are very, heavy use of spectrum. At the same time, as the Army now, as military modernizes, it uses spectrum more. And so, international comparisons are very difficult given the unique role that America plays. It really puts, I think, the onus on NTIA and also thinkers, in private industries as well, to think of ways that we can share spectrum, because other mechanisms that we might prefer, like markets, simply just don't work. As a practical matter, when dealing with such matters as national security, and so that I think the onus is on being innovative and being meticulous and trying to get the best information to make sure that these plans of spectrum allocation work effectively.
So, Jim, you've obviously been observing this discussion on all sides over many years. I imagine there's some deja vu there, but maybe you see, new opportunities. We had a question come in from the audience. It says, how do the Biden and incoming Trump administration differ on spectrum issues, if at all? What emerges here from this discussion for you?
Both the current administration and the incoming administration have similar things they need to do. The first is they've got to restore auction authority and the spectrum relocation fund. That was the core of the ability to be flexible in use. So that's sort of a no-brainer. A lot of this falls on Congress, but you need the administration to push it. The second is we need to align with the rest of the world on spectrum use, on licensing, and on frequencies. We're kind of like becoming Spectrum Island, where our uses are so different from the rest of the world. And, I'm a big fan of American exceptionalism, but maybe not in this case. Another thing to think about is how do we fix the governance of spectrum? It's been gridlocked. And the way I came back into spectrum after ignoring it for a while is, remember an agency blocked the deployment of 5G around airports because they were afraid, and this was their quote, airplanes would fall from the sky, right? Which was really cute because no other country on the world had the same belief. So either the laws of physics are different here in the United States, which is possible, or we got it wrong. And that's because you needed to be a little tougher in telling agencies, this is the way we have to move. And the core of this and I think all of our speakers have touched on it, is we really need to rethink national security for the 21st century. The things we did in the 20th century when there was less competition for spectrum, when weapons were different, when EW and drones were less important, those aren't going to work, right? And so that rethink is essential. But those are problems that confronted this administration. They were making some progress, and they're problems that will confront the incoming administration. And I hope they can continue to improve.
Great point. Arthur, I'm curious, in your quantum alliance there, you are obviously working with a number of stakeholders that are looking at some of these challenges. What you might share some of their perspectives. How do they see this? Do they feel that they are being hobbled because they can't get access to the spectrum that they need, or they feel they can work within constraints?
Well, and you had asked about this earlier, and I didn't give you an answer, because in many ways the quantum factor comes in not so much in terms of the use of spectrum as in protection and security. Quantum computers don't require a lot of bandwidth, even with quantum communication of the kind that the Department of Defense and others are talking about, ways in which to link up quantum computers so you can develop a kind of quantum supercomputer. This is all nothing which is going to require large swaths of bandwidth by any means. But where quantum communication is, that begins to move into space, and the whole development of bandwidth and the opening up of space and space networks. We're talking about by 2026, by one estimate, we're talking about something like 7 terabits of capacity through space commercial networks that's going to open up as a result of that. The use and development, including 5G networks, of providing security for networks, even security for devices, is going to require more and more focus and attention to quantum technology, both post-quantum cryptography as a way to protect networks, to render them immune from or protect them from future quantum computer attack and hacking, which also protects you from from current hacking as well as hacking in the future, but then also of quantum key distribution technology as ways to protect point-to-point communications in space or within a 5G network ecosystem, and then also of random-based quantum random number generator protection that you can use to protect devices and to secure encryption on those devices and protect them from those kinds of threats. Companies like, for example, Quantum Emotions, a Canadian company that's found a way to blend quantum random number generator technology with, at the same time, post-quantum cryptography. All these are going to become more and more important for protecting the entire telecommunications sector, and ways in which we can render that immune from and protect from the kinds of threats today, the kinds of threats we face in the future. So quantum comes into this discussion, again, not as a user of bandwidth or of 5G or of telecommunication networks per se, but as a powerful means by which to protect those networks and protect those devices from the kinds of threats that could be really catastrophic from a national security point of view. That's what we've been doing at the Quantum Alliance Initiative, is highlighting just how severe and how grave that threat can be unless we are going to protect it with using quantum technology.
Thank you. So we only have about 5 minutes left, but I want to turn to you, Umair, because I think the audience should know that there are some excellent reports on the CTIA website. It's really tremendous. You're putting up great information all the time. A recent one on Wi-Fi is excellent. What do we actually need? What's practical? You also have an excellent set of reports on national security, and one which lists the U.S. military's operations in foreign countries. And interestingly enough, we can see in a lot of these hotspots around the world that the military operations are working around the standardized 5G allocations. And for some reason, I think, as Jim said, well, maybe the laws of physics are suspended in the United States of America. But I'd love if you, so an audience question came in. It says, defense industry argues that China is targeting United States national security bans for international harmonization to cripple our defense systems. How can the U.S. protect our national security interests at home and abroad? And maybe you might take that question as well as this notion that, as the U.S., are we at the risk of being a spectrum follower, if we get it wrong? And then, because we have been the spectrum leader for a long time, and now it feels like we're losing some footing here. So maybe you could bring your expertise to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, let me start with the audience question, which is sort of what is China seeking to do, and what does it mean for U.S. spectrum policy? Are they targeting our national security bans as a way to cripple us, or something along those lines? I think first, and Shiva said this right up front. The first thing to acknowledge is that China is actually opposing the spectrum policies that are being advocated for by industry in the United States. And many of the bans that are the subject of the National Spectrum Strategy, for example, they are actively opposing the harmonization of the 7 gigahertz band that would make us competitive with a lot of the deployments in the 6 gigahertz band that are happening around the world. In the lower 3 gigahertz band, China has not been pushing for a full power option there. In fact, in China, they do indoor low power 5G, much like the Department of Defense is seeking in the United States, or other stakeholders aligned with that effort. It's Europe. It's Region 1. It's the Americas. It's South America. It's Africa. It's Middle East. It's Europe that have harmonized the lower 3 gigahertz band for 5G use. The United States would benefit from harmonizing with that use and doing what all of these countries have already done. More than 70 countries have allocated that spectrum for full power 5G. Many of them have already deployed systems in that band. Those systems are already coexisting with the very same radars and other defense technologies that are being operated in the United States. And so the question that we need to answer in these band studies is, why can't the United States do what all these other countries and all these other NATO countries have already done? And I think that's a question worth answering. Accenture released a study not too long ago where it found that if we're able to harmonize our spectrum use for 5G with our allies in this way, it would add up to $200 billion to our economy over the next 10 years. Not doing so, Roslyn, as you noted, it would risk turning us into a spectrum island and limiting our leadership of the global wireless ecosystem. If you look back, traditionally, we've always benefited from driving global spectrum focus at places like the ITU. Over the past several years, sort of the dynamic that we see is that you get these domestic disputes between federal agencies about how spectrum should be used. And what ends up happening is that those domestic disputes sideline us in the international conversations. And what that means is that other countries are picking the bands that end up becoming the focus of global harmonization. And that is consequential. What it allows these other countries to do is they get to set the global spectrum agenda. They get to do it in ways that allows them to get earlier access to spectrum, to make it harder, to make it easier for them to upgrade their industrial bases, and to create opportunities really to become major players globally in infrastructure and equipment markets. So to the extent that those concerns exist, the answer for the United States is we have to get back to a leadership position. We've got to get back to setting the agenda at these international conferences. I am concerned that right now those timelines aren't aligned. If you look at the National Spectrum Strategy in the United States, we have 2-year studies for a lot of the bands that the ITU has already started looking at for the next World Radio Communication Conference. That means we can't wait 2 years before we start exerting our leadership in any way on the global stage. It means we have to start now.
Great. Well, fortunately, we have come to the end of our hour. I think we could do a lot more, and I want to thank CSIS for hosting us today. Our wonderful speakers, Umair, Javed, Adam Candeub, Arthur Herman, Shiva Goel, and Jim Lewis. Before we close, I'm just going to want to restate some of the takeaways that we presented, and then I'm going to give our panel members, you can just give me keywords if we did not cover them. We've talked about restoring auction authority. Hello, Congress, we're talking to you. The Spectrum Relocation Fund needs to be rebooted. We have also aligning with the rest of the world, obviously that the U.S. needs to be a leader in these international meetings. We want to have, we don't want the U.S. to be a spectrum island. Let me put out there any questions. What about are there spectrum bands that we need to harmonize? Anyone have any thoughts on that question?
Well, I'll throw out the additional spectrum in the C-band. There just seems to be a confluence of factors that's creating new opportunity there, whether it's next generation altimeter standards, satellite transactions that offer the potential for more spectrum, and certainly growing interest from the wireless side. But there just seems to be a unique moment to do something in the C-band as well. And then certainly the other bands that are being studied globally for harmonization, 4 gigahertz, 10 gigahertz, others are all worth focus as well.
Excellent. Great. I'm going to give Adam keywords for takeaways.
I think government commitment to getting the job done is an important point.
Got it. And Arthur, keywords to close.
What I would say is we never had a plan about nationalizing 5G. That was never part of our agenda in terms of thinking about a U.S. alternative to what China's doing. But I am going to endorse what Umair just said, and that is U.S. leadership is essential. And if we don't take the leadership, China will. And that's going to be very, very bad news for democracy, for freedom, for really the future and development of technologies. No doubt about it.
Thank you so much. And Jim, excellent reports. I know that everyone can get them on the CSIS website. This event will be posted on the CSIS YouTube account. Any closing remarks for us?
Yeah, I'd just say a couple words. The first is markets are better than governments when it comes to allocating resources. And so that's worth bearing in mind. Not always, but usually. And second, we have to adjust to a new style warfare and bring our spectrum policy in line with that. So that's actually 4 words, but I'll stop with them.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the audience.